Welcome to you all for this final session in this series. Before I get into what I have to say today, I want to call your attention to the fact that we have posted on the adult education part of the Lewinsville website a small list, sorry, a small list of the citations from my previous presentations. Some of you have asked for that, and I have provided it. It's not a full bibliography, it's just a list of the works to which I have referred, and that may be of interest to some of you about the authors that I have been discussing in this series. Today, I want to talk about the relationship between Black Presbyterians, and the Reformed tradition. And I want to begin with this observation. The title to which I have, the title I've given to this series of talks, Black and Reformed, the Witness of American Black Presbyterians, could be construed as misleading. Could be construed indeed as very misleading for the following reason. By virtue of being Presbyterian, Black Presbyterians are in some way part of the Reformed tradition. But this is not something they have emphasized. Let me say that again. This is not something they have emphasized. And when I say they, I'm talking about the very people who are the subject of the previous 4 presentations. Indeed, when they have acknowledged it, they have tended to speak rather critically of the Reformed tradition. Even, I would say, at times polemically about the Reformed tradition. And let me just cite Gay Wilmore here as an example, probably the most important and significant illustration of this. More than once, he said in his writings and sometimes in his public addresses, the Reformed tradition is characterized by a congenital and pervasive racism. The Reformed tradition is characterized by a congenital and pervasive racism. That's pretty blanket criticism. So you could well draw the conclusion that Black Presbyterians have been Presbyterian and Reformed in spite of their confessional heritage, in spite of the confessional heritage of the church, the denomination which they've identified. Now, I want to suggest to you in this presentation that my own view is that the matter is more complicated than that, considerably more complicated than that. The distancing of Black Presbyterians from the Reformed tradition, that's unmistakably there, is not the whole story. It's a very important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And let me now give you the other side of the story as I see it. In getting into this topic, I want to stress that the Reformed tradition, and I've said this again and again and again in presentations at Lewinsville over the years, is not just a set of doctrines, is not just a set of doctrines. That's what's so misleading about discussing any particular religious tradition simply in terms of beliefs. It's not just a set of doctrines. It's equally, if not more importantly, a particular way of being a Christian. Let me say that again. It's not just a set of doctrines. It's a particular way of being a Christian. Indeed, for those who are really caught up in the Reformed way of thinking and acting, it is a whole way of life. It has been historically. And in that sense, I want to suggest Black Presbyterians in this country have been very much a part of the Reformed tradition. I'm using here, if you will, a kind of sociological as opposed to a theological or doctrinal way of thinking about the subject. It's something I believe strongly is important all the way along. And by the way, I would say this if you were talking about Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever. It's not just a set of doctrines. It's a whole way of being Christian. And in that sense, I want to stress Black Christians, and especially the ones that I talked about in this series, have been in more than one respect very reformed, quite reformed. Now, as we get into this topic, I want to stress a couple of things about these Black Presbyterians, which I think has been implicit in everything I've said up to this point, but it's sometimes ignored or lost sight of, especially when we get into this aspect that I'm discussing this morning of the topic. The first thing to say is the following. Being Presbyterian for all these people was in some degree. I see let me just insert parenthetically here an observation based upon this question I see in the chat from Pat Matheson, which is an important addition to what I have prepared to say. The Reformed tradition is a set of, the Reformed Protestant tradition is a set of beliefs and practices and institutions which emerge at the time of the Protestant Reformation. They're one of several variants of Protestantism that emerged at the time of the Protestant Reformation and then develops over time from the 16th to the 17th to the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century. And most people in the Reformed tradition have been either Presbyterians or Congregationalists in one way or another. But they've also been, and this is the most common way of being Reformed, members of Reformed churches throughout the world, the Dutch Reformed Church or the whatever. So that's the thing I'm talking about, a set of ideas, a set of practices, a set of institutions which have developed over time and spread, in fact, to all parts of the world. Now, end of parenthesis, back to this discussion of Black Presbyterians. Being a Presbyterian, for Blacks in particular, was a choice they made. Let me say it again. It's a choice they made. And it's a very important thing to grasp that it's a choice they made because of the fact that the vast majority of Blacks, the vast majority of Black Christians, most of whom are Protestant in this country, always have been, the vast majority have been Protestants. Most of them have not been Presbyterians or Anglicans, not been members of predominantly white denominations. They have been members of historically Black denominations, especially Methodists and Baptists. So all along in the development of Black Presbyterianism, to be a Black Presbyterian was to, shall we say, make the decision not to affiliate with these historically Black denominations, but rather to become part of, to have one's religious life lived in a predominantly white denomination. It's a very important subset of the Black church. It's a minority of Black Christians, a majority of Black Protestants. So presumably anybody who was in that position was deciding in one way or another, his or her family was deciding at least, we're going to be part of that predominantly white denomination rather than be a part of the AME Zion or the National Baptist Church. So it was a choice they made. And it's a very interesting question. Well, as they made that choice, what was it that appealed to them? What was it that drew them in the direction of identifying with a predominantly white denomination rather than being part of these historically Black denominations? Very important distinction. And I want to stress to you, these Black Presbyterians were well aware of that. They were well aware of the fact that they were part of something which was different from the historically Black churches, which were independent of any white leadership or control. Second thing I want to stress about this group of people, these Black Presbyterians that I've been talking about through focusing on their leaders, is that they almost without exception came from a particular stratum within the Black community. Let me say that again. They came from a particular, in sociological terms, they came from a particular stratum within the Black community. There's a famous book on this stratum called The Black Bourgeoisie, a very important book in Black studies. The Black Bourgeoisie, that's what Du Bois called the talented 10th, the people who were more accomplished, in terms of education, more accomplished in terms of professional standing, and generally had aspirations to become not just middle class, but upper middle class. Without exception, Black Presbyterians were people who could read and write. And not only could they read and write, but they were people typically who had great aspirations when it came to education. For the longest time, and to some extent still, but for the longest time in the development of the Black community, they stood out as a particular subculture. I've referred to many times the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in DC, which still exists, a very important historic Black church. That church, particularly at the time of Francis Grimke, was made up of people who were very successful, especially in the civil service in the federal government. It's one of the reasons why Wilson's segregation of the federal bureaucracy was so annoying to them. Annoying would be a weak word. It appalled them. Well, that's the kind of stratum that of the Black population who were drawn in this direction of becoming Presbyterians. And I want to stress that in that respect, Black Presbyterians were like what most white Presbyterians had been. If you think about the makeup of white Presbyterian churches, they're pretty much what I've just described. And let me elaborate more fully. Reformed churches across the whole world generally have drawn from people of the middle class, the educated classes, and people who aspire to upper middle class status. Some people have even joked the Presbyterians are the upper middle class of prayer. It's a particular type of person, and it will not surprise you that people of that kind are drawn to churches which have a certain makeup, a certain quality, a certain ethos. And to state the obvious, Lewinsville is no exception in this regard. Indeed, Lewinsville, in some respects, is prototypically Presbyterian in that regard. Now, that's background to my main point. I've stressed two things. These are people who made a choice. And by the way, they could have made it even as they moved from one generation to another. They could have made another choice. And it will not surprise you, those of you who are accustomed to thinking sociologically, that sometimes people who were drawn in this direction eventually became not just Presbyterians, but Episcopalians as their, shall we say, their prospects improved, their social and economic prospects improved. But they made a choice, and they made a choice out of, I would say, a certain social situation. They were not manual laborers, to draw the obvious contrast. Presbyterians have always had very, very few people who were part of labor unions, for example. Now, with that as background, let me say 3 or 4 things about what I meant when I said these people were, in terms of their living out of the Christian life, and by extension, their understanding of the Christian life, conducted themselves in a way that was very much in keeping with the Reformed tradition. Indeed, I want to go farther and say they were quintessentially Reformed in that aspect. 4 things I want to suggest here. Number 1, they were drawn to and liked. Just think, for example, about Gay Wilmore's parents becoming Presbyterians by virtue of a building. Those of you who were here will remember that he became a Presbyterian because the white Presbyterians moved out of North Philadelphia where they lived, and there was a building available, and the white Presbyterians made the building available to leadership in the Black community, and by virtue of that development, that kind of, shall we say, accident of providence, they became Presbyterians. And once they were in the Presbyterian church, says Gay Wilmore, they liked it. They liked it a lot. Well, what would it be about that? And by the way, then became, in a whole several generations of people became staunch Presbyterians. Well, one of the most important things is this. One of the authors that I like a lot in discussing this aspect of the Reformed tradition says, one of the things that's characterized this particular brand of Christianity is intellectual seriousness. Now, speaking in this context to this group, I don't need to elaborate much on that, but let me just dwell on it. Intellectual seriousness. Above all, what it meant was that they valued education in many different respects. valued education in many different respects. And as I've been telling this story, I've been going along emphasizing the migration of the American Black community, the American Black population, away from a condition of desperate lack of culture in the usual sense, in the direction of literacy and then more and more education. And I stressed all along that Presbyterians, insofar as white Presbyterians have a positive role to play in this, and I've talked a lot about their lack of positive role, but insofar as they played a positive role, it was above all their recognition of the importance of providing education in abundance to the Black community. And they did that. And that was appreciated, that was reciprocated. A lot of Blacks who benefited from that experience became Presbyterian. But let me just refine this point a bit. Another very important feature of the whole Reformed tradition, it's been one of its calling cards all along, one of its defining features all along, is an emphasis on two things that go together. Sometimes we just get one part of it. Of course, one part of it is an emphasis on an educated clergy, an educated clergy. And we're talking not just about basic education here, we're talking about a very high level of education, all the way along, going all the way back to, I was asked a question a moment ago about the roots of this. Well, it goes all the way back to the time of the Reformation, when they insisted, partly in criticism of the lack of adequate preparation of Catholic clergy. They said, we have to have people who really know their stuff when it comes to theology and the Bible. They've got to know those biblical languages in the original languages. They've got to be able to analyze the text well. And they've got to be educated in some broader sense. That has always been characteristic of Reformed churches all over the world. And by the way, to this day, Lane and others can testify, if you haven't got the credentials in that regard, you're not going to be ordained. You're simply not going to be ordained. That appealed very much to the kind of the part of the Black population that I've been discussing in this series. But the other part of it that I want to stress is, which sometimes has been lost sight of, is equally, for many centuries, not just at the beginning, there was a very strong emphasis on lay education. We want a biblically and theologically educated lay population. Indeed, the two things went together. Highly educated clergy, highly educated lay people together discussing and making sense of the faith. Now, to the Black population that I've been discussing in this series, that was received on the whole very enthusiastically. And it's one of the reasons why historically, if I've got this right, and I've been trying to get this details on this, but I've heard generalizations made, particularly by people who know about Black history, Black church history, that the effect of that in some parts of the Black Presbyterian world, at least, was a very high degree of biblical literacy, a very high degree of biblical literacy. And I've even heard people say, if you go to some Black church or Black Presbyterian churches today, the level of biblical literacy among those people is higher than among white Presbyterians. So, intellectual seriousness. And of course, it was not true of all the Black community. Some of the Black community were very much drawn to a kind of populist version of Christianity, which was, if not anti-intellectual, at least a-intellectual, not very respectful of serious learning. A second characteristic of the Reformed tradition sociologically is this. It has been, and sometimes this has put people off, it has been characterized by a very high level of moral seriousness and even moral rigor. Moral seriousness and moral rigor. One of the jokes about Puritans that has oftentimes been made, and of course Puritans are part of the Reformed tradition, is that for them, life was no laughing matter. To be, you were put on this earth. The sort of the core of the idea of calling is you were put on this earth to do something important. You were put on this earth to do something important, and by God, you'd better put your nose to the grindstone and develop your talents and do everything you could to realize that purpose for which you had been put on this earth. That translated in terms of all kinds of other things, industriousness, thrift, the kind of things that the famous sociologist Max Weber characterized as the Protestant ethic. Now, how does that relate to the Black community? If you were here when I discussed Francis Grimke, you may remember that I characterized him, quoting a famous student of his work, as a Black Puritan, And one of his main themes in his preaching was the following: those white people think of us Blacks as shiftless and no good and lazy and worse. They say that about us all the time. And our responsibility as Christians, in order to meet that challenge, is to show through our lives, through the way we live our lives, the falsity of those claims made about us. That's utterly false. We as Black people can be as morally responsible as whites any day, and we need to prove it. So we need to work hard, and we need to be thrifty, and we need to be disciplined in the way we live our lives in all kinds of ways. And through that, and sometimes the phrase he would use is, we need to be as upright and even more than they are, as upright and even more than they are. So the whole idea, which is central to so much of the Reformed tradition, especially for its first 2 or 3 centuries, of living an upright life, a morally upright life, being an example of rectitude, was very appealing to the members of the Black community to which I've been discussing. And part of their reason for being attracted to it was that they saw, as Grimke did and expressed it so well, an answer to these claims, these utterly racist claims made about the irresponsibility, the immorality of the Black community. And by the way, Grimke said, you may recall, that one of the great challenges of the Black church is to provide such moral formation for its young people that it will provide a clear antidote to the racist claims being made about our community. A third thing, which has always been true of the Reformed tradition, and people who've lived out its particular way of being Christian, is the following: a very strong emphasis on public engagement and social action. Public engagement and social action. At Lewinsville, it sometimes might be forgotten. I don't say it is, but it sometimes might be forgotten that is not always the way Christians think about things. That you should be publicly engaged, that you should be an activist, being in all kinds of different ways out there in the affairs of the world, whether it be the NAACP or the PTA or the Republican Party, or whatever the particular avenue, that you be out there and engaged, living out your faith in the affairs of the world. There have been forms of Christianity, big swaths of historic Christianity, that have resisted the idea of public engagement. They have said over and over again that Christianity does not have to do with that kind of stuff. You need to be, as much as possible, pure of heart and disengaged from that stuff that sometimes can get you into morally complicated situations. Reformed Christianity has consistently resisted that. Indeed, if anything, critics have said in the Reformed tradition, there's such a kind of appetite for power and for moving in the direction of power that they overdo it. Well, the people who were part of the Black Presbyterian world, and I hope you've seen that in this series if you've been part of it, the people who are part of that Black Presbyterian world, all of them saw the terribly great importance in religious terms of being involved in the affairs of the world, and to go back to Henry Highland Garnett, and to use every resource available to pursue the ends, the just ends that need to be pursued in civic life. Big emphasis all the way along in this. I hope you've seen it on politics. Apolitical Christianity is not Reformed Christianity. And I say that, let me say parenthetically, as somebody who grew up in a Presbyterian church that was deeply pietistic, where I didn't get that word, I didn't get that message. And I now look back upon it as a kind of defect in the way in which Presbyterianism had evolved in that particular corner of which I was a part. It's contrary to the central thrust of the Reformed tradition. And Black Christians, Black Presbyterians by and large, got the right message on this and acted on it. And then finally, a very important other theme, which at Lewinsville, you don't need to even mention it, but it's a terribly important thing to mention in this context, and that is the Reformed tradition has always been characterized by a reforming impulse in its own life, but also a reforming impulse in relation to the wider world, the wider societies. Now, what do I mean by a reforming impulse? The people who introduced that idea of reform, where it became so central to the thinking of Reformed Christians that it became the label that they put on themselves, Christ churches truly reformed. That's where the term comes from. Christ churches truly reformed at the time of the Reformation. Well, why would you say reform is so central that it's almost your DNA? Well, here's the answer. The presupposition was human beings are sinful in their very character. There's just something about the human, the way in which human beings conduct their lives, that there is a pervasive sinfulness. It's not the whole story. There's grace at work, powerfully at work, redemptively at work. And you might say the Reformed view is a kind of tug of war between this redemptive work that's going on in the affairs of the world. But there is always human sinfulness, and all human institutions, including the church, are to some extent compromised by human sinfulness. Let me say that again. All human institutions, including even the very best ones, including Calvin's own church, are to some extent compromised by human sinfulness, and therefore always in principle in need of reform. Always in principle in need of reform. And so you then get that translated into, and particularly in the early days of the Reformed tradition, intense efforts, even to the point of violent revolutionary activity, intense efforts to reform institutions, to bring them closer to what God intended them to be. Now, I hope you see, if you're a Black person living in the United States of America, with its slavery, with its segregation, why that would be an appealing idea, and why you would be drawn to a church where that was so much a central theme, especially when joined to the previous one of the importance of public engagement and social activism. Hey, you look at those four things: intellectual seriousness, moral seriousness, a priority given to public engagement and social activism, and finally, a reforming impulse. All of that part of the sort of the standard way in which Reformed Christians have approached life all over the world. I hope you see why it's very easy for me to draw the conclusion, in many respects, these Black Presbyterians were quintessentially reformed. Let me say that again. They were quintessentially reformed. Indeed, in some respects, you could argue, looking at the people I've been mentioning here, been discussing, they were notable exemplars of the Reformed tradition. In years past, I've done sort of biographical sketches at Lewinsville and other places of the people in the Reformed tradition. I never included any Black people in that at the time I initially did it. Now, I would have to say, if I were to do it again, Black people would have to be in there and be there displayed prominently because of the way in which they illustrate so well some of the characteristic themes of the Reformed tradition. Well, now let me pause. The things I've discussed are barely recognized, at least in the writings and the public statements, by most Black Presbyterians. Let me say that again, barely recognized as being Reformed, as being part of the Reformed tradition. They are barely recognized in the statements and public witness of Black Presbyterians, in the figures in particular that I've been discussing in this series, who are arguably the most notable of all. The most notable of all figures in the development of the Black Presbyterian witness. You find scarcely any mention of the things I've been discussing, at least in terms of linking them specifically to the Reformed tradition. I would say, with very few exceptions, one looks in vain throughout the Black Presbyterian witness to a positive affirmation of the Reformed tradition. One looks in vain throughout the witness of Black Presbyterians to a positive affirmation of the Reformed tradition until very recently. And let me just call your attention to something which some of us heard a couple of weeks ago. One of the more notable things about that address that Brian Blunt gave to the Reformed Institute's convocation, he's a Black man, he's the president of Presbyterian Theological Seminary and Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond, prominent theological seminary. That was one of the first times I had ever heard a Black man stand up and in effect affirm and embrace the Reformed tradition. And he did it very elaborately and very eloquently. That's very late in the game. In the 2020s, you finally get an affirmation of that. And he's a notable figure. My guess is that address will be treated as a notable event for that reason. But having said that, let me now say, there are other places you can go in the wider Reformed world to get such an affirmation, to find such an affirmation. And I want to briefly introduce one of those places, which is notable and equally notable and more prominent thus far than the address that Brian Blunt gave. I want to talk here about a South African colored man named Alan Bosack. And I apologize that I did not put his name and his book on the list that is made available on the website. So let me just spell it for you. B-O-E-S-A-K, B-O-E-S-A-K, Alan Bosack, the Reverend Alan Bosack, South African pastor, leader of the Reformed movement in South Africa, that is the Christian Reformed movement in South Africa, anti-apartheid activist, one of the leading forces behind the Belhard Declaration, which was included in our Book of Confessions recently. And ultimately, he became the president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches and was very instrumental in bringing about something, I've already alluded to this, that happened in the 1980s, which he thinks was politically significant, and that was in the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, apartheid was declared a heresy, as well it should have been. It was declared a heresy. And he said in South Africa being a place where Dutch Reformed influences were so powerful, that had a definite political impact, an important political impact, not just on church folk, but on the wider community. And it was one of the things that helped to contribute to the downfall of apartheid. And then in the midst of all that, he wrote a book. And the title of the book is Black and Reformed. Black and Reformed, a 1980s book I commend to you, available in a more recent edition for your reading. And by the way, we had Bosack speak at a convocation of the Reformed Institute. It was a memorable event to encounter this, I would, from my point of view, hero of the anti-apartheid struggle, but also a very, very sophisticated theological mind. In Black and Reformed, he says the following: here's what Black Presbyterians until Brian Blunt have never said. They could have said, but they didn't say. I understand perfectly well their sort of uneasiness about the Reformed tradition. Boy, do I understand it. But Bosack had a comparable experience, but came out in a somewhat different place. And I want to briefly summarize what he had to say. He said, and by the way, he was more elaborate on this point that I'm about to discuss when we gathered with him for that weekend some years ago around the Reformed Institute convocation. He said, when I grew up in South Africa, my assumption was that the Reformed tradition was inherently racist because the Dutch Reformed were the architects of apartheid. I mean, he said not only were they architects of apartheid, he said they provided the most elaborate philosophical and theological justification for apartheid, racial separation. I mean, it was sort of another version of what we in the United States experienced as segregation in its Jim Crow days. He says, when I thought of those things that I experienced as a child and was constantly victimized by as a child, he said, I just assumed that was what the Reformed tradition was. He said, I wouldn't even carried into my mind the thought that Calvin, I just vaguely heard about that guy, but maybe Calvin was the guy who ultimately was the source of the idea of apartheid. He said, I don't know, maybe it was in the Institute somewhere, book 3 or something, that you were supposed to separate the races and keep the black folk down. But he said, in the grace of God, I felt a call to the ministry and was sent to Europe to study theology. And of course, he went to the Netherlands. He went to the Netherlands, and he said, there in the Netherlands, I discovered all kinds of things. He said, first of all, he said, I was exposed to a different kind of Reformed Christianity. I was exposed to a different kind of Reformed theology. And he said, I began to see the problems with the stuff that I'd been exposed to in South Africa. He also says, I learned about the history of Reformed Christianity in European affairs, European politics. And he said, I began to see that there's something else to this besides this apartheid stuff. Indeed, he says, the more I learned, the more in my own mind, he said, I actually read Calvin. He said, I asked seminary professors, where in Calvin is this apartheid stuff? Of course, they told me it was not there. Not only it was not there, but it was a heresy. And he said, the more I absorbed that, he said, it complicated my thinking in very good ways. And then he said, I returned to South Africa, where he was jailed, by the way, like Tutu. He says, as I got into this struggle and began to employ the Reformed ideas that I had used I encountered in Europe, began to employ them in the anti-apartheid struggle, he said, it seemed to me, the more I experienced this, that in fact, the Reformed ideas were more on the side of anti-apartheid than the defense of apartheid, and that the defense of apartheid was a kind of corruption of that tradition. He said, as a result of those experiences, my study abroad, and by the way, at one point he came to the United States, was caught up, he told us, in the civil rights struggle that was going on in that period. He said, I can't tell you how much my imagination as a young South African was sparked by these events taking place. He said, not just on the streets, but in the churches in the United States. He said, I can't tell you how exciting that was to me as a young man. And then I go back to South Africa and I began to promote these ideas. And he said, I began to hear about liberation theology. And he said, that was just sort of music to my ears as I was involved in the civil rights struggle there in South Africa. As a result of that, he said, my own sort of settled view has come to be the following. There's nothing in the core tenets of Reformed theology that is racist, nothing. Now, I have to tell you, that's a debatable proposition, but that's Bosack's position. And what I'm concerned here, not about other people's views, but the views of Blacks themselves. Bosack is one of the most leading figures internationally on the issue of racism and Christianity. Nothing in the core tenets of the Reformed tradition is racist. Indeed, he says, I came to believe that the central thrust of Reformed theology is anti-racist. Inherent sinfulness of human institutions. Remember that? Inherent sinfulness of human institutions. The need for reform of those institutions where we find that they are contrary to what we believe to be God's will on the basis of our reading of Scripture. And then he said, the other thing that I was blown away by was the fact that when you look back at the history of this tradition, all the people who sometimes gave their lives for struggles against injustice, against oppression. He said this, what I characterized as reforming impulse, to me, struck me as a kind of invitation to be a person like that in the anti-apartheid struggle. And then he said, by the time I was moving along down this path, he said, I came to think of Reformed theology itself as a form of liberation theology. I came to think of Reformed tradition itself as a form of liberation theology. Above all, in the invitation to struggle against oppression that it provides. And then he asks, toward the end of this book, which is just a wonderfully suggestive treatment of the topic that I'm addressing here. He says, once I sort of, my thinking had evolved in this direction, and literally my thinking had been turned upside down from where I started as a child. He said, I had to ask myself the question, how did apartheid happen? And how did this entanglement of Reformed theology and the institutions and practices of apartheid happen? And he offers this very interesting observation. I found it very intriguing when I first heard it, and it's stuck with me ever since. He said, you know, theological ideas like other ideas. Some of you know I study the history of political ideas for a living. He says, theological ideas like other important ideas can easily be taken over by folk movements and read selectively in ways that corrupt their meaning entirely. Let me say that again. Theological ideas like political ideas can easily be taken over by folk movements, you know, popular movements, can easily be taken over by folk movements and interpreted in ways which distort their meaning so badly that it's almost the opposite of what the original. He said that's what we were dealing with in South Africa. We were dealing with it's a kind of the Afrikaner religion. He says is kind of like a folk Christianity, which in important ways subverts the central claims of what I believe to be scriptural teaching. Now, the last segment of what I have to say is designed to complement this witness of Alan Bosack. I've already said there's nothing comparable, at least that I can find, in the witness of Black Presbyterians in this country to what Bosack said. I haven't been able to find it. But there have been intimations of the thing that Bosack said in the thoughts of some Black Presbyterians. And I just learned about one this past week, which I want to share with you. There were a few of us who were present at this wonderful event sponsored by Black Presbyterians United this past Thursday night that was devoted to a kind of an alternative interpretation, complementary to mine, I think, but alternative interpretation of Gay Wilmore and his life by a man who's writing a book about Gay Wilmore. And he talked in great length about the relationship between Gay Wilmore and Black theology, Black liberation theology. His name is Douglas Brown Clark. And in the course of the presentation he made, by the way, to a predominantly Black audience. This was very interesting. There were about 75 people on the call, and I would say 60 of them were Black Presbyterians, mainly from the Washington area. It was very interesting. And they were, after his presentation, they were peppering him with all kinds of interesting anecdotes, remembering Gay Wilmore, but also raising questions. Anyway, he told about one thing which really was very interesting to me, and I want to share it in conclusion. You may recall that when I talked about Gay Wilmore 2 weeks ago, I talked about his, and he's the guy, by the way, let me just remind you, he's the guy who said the Reformed tradition is just permeated by a kind of, permeated by racism. This is Gay Wilmore. Same guy. Wilmore, I said 2 weeks ago, was on the commission, the group of about 12 people who were tasked with writing the famous Confession of 67, 1967. I think I've already, for reasons I've already discussed here in other contexts, that is at Lewinsville I think that's a kind of turning point, a watershed moment, the evolution of American Presbyterianism doctrinally, theologically, the adoption of the Confession of 67, and equally not only the adoption of the Confession of 67, but the complementary thing, and I think even more important thing, was the replacement of the Westminster standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the two catechisms, the replacement of that by a book of confessions, a book of 7 or 8 confessions that are the doctrinal foundation of our church. Gay Wilmore was part of the committee of people who came to that, to propose that. And you may recall, if you were here 2 weeks ago, that I said Gay Wilmore himself characterized that as a very unpleasant experience. He was meeting with that group. They met for, I guess, 6 years, working out that's a very complicated business, working out a confessional statement, really rethinking the doctrinal basis of the church. He said the source of his discomfort was in part the fact that he was the only person of color in the room. And by the way, there was one woman in the room, a bunch of white guys, one woman, one person of color. And he said, this is just repeating what I said before, he said in public comments about this, he said, I was dissatisfied with the whole experience because I would press upon them the importance of taking into account the racial turmoil that was occurring in our society. This is the 1960s. There was a racial upheaval going on, and that needed to be taken directly into account in the drafting of this confessional statement. That was the Kairos moment, if you will, for American Blacks in dealing with racism in this country, and that needed to be reflected in the confession. And on the whole, it was not. He said, there's a little paragraph in there, which I wrote. It's a small part of what I suggested they add to the confession, only a small part. And he said, the whole theme of that is about reconciliation, nothing having to do with justice. He said, I'm not opposed to reconciliation, but I think reconciliation is no substitute for justice. So that was his criticism. And he, by the way, he was rather outspoken about this. I'm not going to say that I oppose the Confession of 67, but I think this is a very, very weak document in response to the current challenges of that particular time. Now, here's what I learned last Thursday night. He then, right shortly after that experience, gets caught up in the Black Power movement, and in particular becomes one of the leading figures in something I mentioned in the last 2 sessions, the National Conference of Black Churchmen, which was a kind of alliance mainly of people who were of color in predominantly white denominations, who were in their own churches advocates of Black power and the theology of Black theology of liberation. And again, I didn't know this very well. I'd heard just references to it, but our speaker said that Wilmore became the chairman of the theological commission of this National Conference of Black Churchmen. And he said, this is even before James Cone's book is published. In that circle, they began talking about Black liberation theology. And he said, Wilmore, and he reported, and by the way, much of what I'm telling you now is a result of conversations that our speaker had with Gay Wilmore. They're not recorded anywhere. Wilmore told me that in the meetings of that theological commission made up entirely of Black voices, theological voices, we were moving directly in the direction that James Cone articulated in the theology of Black liberation. So much so, he said, that when that book appeared, he said, we all said, hallelujah. This is finally a clear articulation, even before we could get our act together to fully develop this as a theological position for us. There it was, beginning to emerge in that what turned out to be, in his mind, a great book. Now, I'm winding up here to throw a punch, and here it comes. In our speakers, Douglas Brown Clark's conversations with Gay Wilmore, Gay said the following. He said, you know, what we were aiming for and never quite achieved in that theological commission of the Black the National Conference of Black Churchmen. What we were aiming for was a Barman-like declaration. Now, for those of you who've read the Book of Confessions, you know that one of the key documents in the Book of Confessions is the Barman Declaration, which was the declaration by the confessing church in Germany of its opposition to not just Adolf Hitler, but the whole theological justification for Nazism that had been developed by a group called German Christians who were enthusiastically supporting Nazism. And that becomes, in turn, in the minds of so many people who are sort of know anything about the Reformed tradition, as a kind of dramatic example, because many people, it cost some of those people their lives, people signatories to it, but other people lost their jobs and so forth. It becomes a kind of dramatic illustration of that reforming impulse at work. Now, it was obvious that Gay Wilmore, who was part of the group who chose the documents for the Book of Confessions, that clearly the inclusion of that Barman Declaration in that Book of Confessions was something very important to him. So much so that he went on to say to our friend, the speaker Thursday night, so much so that what we really needed as a society was something comparable to the Barman Declaration on race. Let me say that again, something comparable to the Barman Declaration on race, which drew a line firmly in the stand against racism, declared racism to be heretical. Now, the last thing our speaker said was the following. Eventually, the denomination of which all of us are a part chose to include in its Book of Confessions the Belhard Declaration. The Belhard Declaration, written to a large extent by Alan Bosack, which is the South African equivalent to Barman, which declares in that document racism to be a sin and an evil, unequivocally. It was eventually included in the Book of Confessions. It's there now, and he said that I suppose you could argue was a kind of concession to the point that Gay Wilmore was making all along. Now, I would conclude my presentation by saying it's a concession, but that's a pretty weak concession in my humble estimation. And you could argue that the thing that Gay Wilmore was hoping for, looking for in the late 1960s is still yet to be achieved by American Presbyterians, including, of course, the white ones. Let me stop there. Kathy, I have not gone to the bitter end. I think we have time for a few questions and comments. Floor is open.
I have one if others are thinking. You talked a little bit about the strengths of the Reformed tradition for addressing injustice of various kinds, including racial injustice. I wonder whether you think there are specific weaknesses of the Reformed tradition that makes it vulnerable to failing to respond or even to helping to build up unjust institutions, as we saw in South Africa, as we saw in the active participation of some American Reformed parts of the American Reformed tradition in slavery and segregation and Jim Crow.
Well, let me just, am I on? Yes. Let me say, the fundamental fact about the Reformed tradition that you have to appreciate, and certainly James Cone emphasizes this, is that it is a white man's creation. The creation of white people, and the white people could easily get into their minds as a result of that some of the key ideas theologically of the Reformed tradition, especially the idea of election and calling and a special identity for the people of faith, a special role for the people of faith, in history, translates into a special responsibility and role for white people in relation to the rest of humanity. That's the most common thing that's cited. And there is some good basis for that, because the particularly in the Afrikaner case, but I think also in much of the history of American white racism, that played a role, absolutely. Anytime you single out a special community for a special role, you got to be very careful there. And given what I've just said, a second thing which is sometimes mentioned, and I have sort of a mixed mind about this, is the emphasis on scripture in the way that it has so dominated Reformed thinking about theology can lend itself to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism has been a very, very closely linked to racism in the American experience and the South African experience as well. It's a particular way of reading scripture that easily leads to the notion that slavery, that segregation, and all these things are justified in the eyes of God. It was called in the days of the Great Awakening common sense literalism. We don't need all this sophisticated stuff. We just need common sense literal readings of the Bible. Well, what does common sense literalism mean? Common sense literalism all too often means pluck out a particular passage of scripture which seems to justify some particular practice that you have, without very much connection to the wider message of the scripture. And certainly in the case of slavery in particular, but also segregation, that was just rampant. The great theological defenses of slavery and segregation all turned on a common sense literal interpretation of certain passages in Paul, certain passages in the Old Testament. Now, the reason I'm somewhat ambivalent about it, I think that's absolutely true. That's what happened. But I also would say those ways of interpreting scripture are not in keeping with, shall we say, the sort of fundamental thrust of Reformed thinking about how the Bible is to be used. If there's anything which is characteristic of the Reformed tradition, at least at its best, it's an insistence upon the large message of the Bible as being the fundamental thing. The way of reading the Bible, which picks it apart and focuses on this passage or that passage, independent of the large message, is itself, it seems to me, very unreformed. But I have to acknowledge that many Reformed people, especially those given to fundamentalism, have certainly easily moved in that direction. And sort of linking that to the idea that the Bible alone is authoritative easily lends itself to drawing the conclusions that are so problematic. Those are two things that are commonly mentioned.
I'm seeing Rob's hand. Thank you. And I'm seeing Rob's hand.
Yeah, Bruce, I was struck during your presentation with your comment that when you're talking about the Reformed tradition's emphasis on education, it has not in general been a church that's attracted union members, manual laborers, and so on. I wonder if you couldn't, we normally think of that emphasis on education as a strength. But I was thinking about the implications of that comment, which is relevant to the race issues in part because for a lot of socioeconomic reasons we're all aware of, the majority of Blacks in this country have generally been in the lower socioeconomic strata. The only church that I can think of that bridges that divide, major Christian denomination, is the Catholic Church. And they bridge it in part because their insistence there is one church. And they bridge it also in part because of the way they used to do their parishes geographically, which would at least sometimes bring people of somewhat different points of view and backgrounds together. I just wonder if you think that could be considered a weakness of the Reformed tradition.
Well, that's a good topic. And let me say two or three things about it. I'm resisting the temptation to give another lecture. I think you're absolutely, first of all, I think you're absolutely right about the difference between Catholics and Protestants in this regard. People who know a lot more about the subject than I have said precisely that, Rob. Indeed, what you did was articulate I think, one of the main themes of Richard Niebuhr's famous book, The Social Sources of Denominationalism. And one of those themes is that once the Reformation produces this splintering of Christianity, the splintering very quickly follows class, national, and so forth lines. And so you can look at, for example, the range of American Protestantism, and you can say, well, those are people of a certain type. For example, Methodists and Baptists who did not emphasize education. That was one of their sort of emphases in the Great Awakenings. They said, we don't need all that schooling. We don't need all that education. Above all, you don't need all that schooling and education in order to be a good pastor, in order to be a good preacher. What matters is what he's got in his, and it was always his at that point, his heart, not his head. So there's been an evolution in both, in much of evangelicalism in the direction of more emphasis on education. But at the beginning, the Presbyterians, Episcopalians on the one hand, the Methodists and the Baptists on the other, had a great divide with regard to that issue. Let me add, a second point, Presbyterians, and I would say generally, mainline Protestants have had a very difficult time connecting well with the industrial working class. That's just been a problem, and I think it's not just the emphasis on book learning per se; it's the ethos that's created in worship, in sort of congregational life. A third point I want to make is this. There actually was a good deal of tension between Blacks in mainline Protestant denominations, historically white denominations, and the historically Black denominations on precisely this topic. Because the Black Presbyterians said over, and they're not unlike the Black Anglicans in this, the Black Presbyterians said over and over and over again, the way to solve the race problem is to have uplift. That was the phrase they used, uplift. Lift them up. Uplift meaning lift them out of that situation in life, which presupposes little education. So the whole sort of emphasis on education was, let's move everybody in the direction of what they understood to be the middle class. Many of the Black leaders in the other denominations said, well, why is that necessary? You can lead a perfectly good, decent life working as a manual laborer. We just need to have a good, a kind of righteous approach to life, but we don't need this uplift stuff. So I hope you see why that's a very important strategic issue. And by the way, the people gathered around the NACP tended to be the people who were drawn to historically white denominations like the Presbyterians. And there was a lot of debate among people in that, particularly in that era, the industrial era, about what should be the emphasis of the Black movement with regard to this issue. Anyway, Rob, that just begins to scratch the surface on this topic, and I think it's a fascinating topic, because this is so central to what Reformed Christians have said all along. I mean, going all the way back to the 16th century, that it's hard for me to imagine a Reformed Christianity which doesn't have, in some version, this at its core.
Thank you.
And I think that is probably a good place to end. Bruce, thank you so much. This has been extremely illuminating. I'm going to stop the recording, and then I will have some coming attractions to talk about briefly.